Ever since playing it for the first time nearly 20 years ago, I've been trying to come to terms with the ending of Link's Awakening. There are a lot of things about this title that make it a unique entry to the Zelda series, but to me at least, the biggest is that it's the only Zelda game where Link doesn't really feel like a hero. By and large, the inhabitants of Koholint Island seem happy. Sometimes the residents fall victim to raids from moblins or curses from the Lost Woods, but there isn't a clear impending danger that threatens their way of life. They don't really need saving. A wizard doesn't usurp the throne, the moon isn't about to crash into the village, a princess, friend, or sister has not been kidnapped. The conflict of the story is that Link is trapped on the island, and the only way to get off of it is by waking the Windfish. In other words, in Awakening, Link is trying to save himself. It is his way of life that's in jeopardy. This is a pretty interesting departure from the typical Zelda formula. Any help he does give to those on the island is secondary, and really just a means to an end. At least at first it is. Really, it is the inhabitants of the island who help Link more than the other way around. Without them, he would never be able to leave. So in a lot of ways, he relies on them to save him. This setup in and of itself is intriguing because the frame is so different than any of the games that came before or after it. What begins as a simple enough story about getting off of an island in the middle of nowhere becomes a lot more complicated once the truth of the Windfish's nature is revealed. Through warnings from the various bosses he defeats, and the information shown on the mural in the ancient ruins, Link learns that the island is just a dream of the Windfish. In Awakening it will end that dream. For Link to return to his way of life, he needs to sacrifice the way of life for every character he's met, for all of those people who have helped him in some way, big or small. So really, Link is the threat. And this is where stuff gets a little muddy. The game asks the question, are lives that come from dreams as valuable as ones that don't? In a real-world context, the obvious answer would be no, they're not. But it is far more complex in Link's Awakening. The Windfish's dream is not a normal one. Real dreams are fluid, shifting from one scene to the next with little rhyme or reason. If this were a normal dream, Marin would turn into Link's math professor halfway through the game and tell him that he missed his final exam. And yes, I've been out of school for years now, and I still get this kind of nightmare. It never ends. In the Windfish's dream, though, everything stays consistent. There are certainly oddities, but things mostly make sense and feel like life, at least like life in a video game. The specifics of how the dream works are never solidified, but it is clearly more real than the dreams of a typical person. The mere fact that Link, an outside force, is able to enter the dream and interact with it shows there is deeper magic to it all. The Windfish almost seems to be a deity of sorts. He has the power to create worlds and people that feel real. Of the first 4 Zelda games, the cast of Awakening is more distinct and memorable than those of any of the other titles, and even Link's relationship with Marin is stronger than the one he shares with Zelda in those earlier games. A Link to the Past ushered in characters with more depth, but Awakening took things a step further and focused even more on Link building relationships with them. Marin is really the first character in the series to have this level of depth. She's not only lovable and endearing, but she also has dreams of her own. Dreams of getting off the island and singing for everyone in the world. This sort of complexity makes for someone players actually want to engage with, and this is a trend that the series has built upon and expanded greatly because it makes players feel far more connected to the people and the world they are trying to save. In Awakening, Link's quest involves meeting the various inhabitants of the island and trading items with them in order to progress, giving Link and the player the chance to meet with the interesting cast of characters. There's also a section where Link and Marin travel together, and if the player decides to explore the island with her, they're rewarded with a handful of charming moments between the two, solidifying their relationship. By structuring the game in this way, it gets players to better understand what will be lost if they continue. These aren't just characters in the background, they are ones that Link and the player have gotten to know. And this chips away at the notion that the player is doing the right thing. Link's desire to leave is not the only thing driving the story forward. Although it isn't clear until the end, the Windfish is actively trying to be awoken. The owl who constantly stops by to ask Link if he would kindly wake the Windfish is acting on the orders of the Windfish. What's even more interesting is that he does so by deceiving Link. It's hard to know where the owl begins and the Windfish ends, so it's impossible to say for certain whether or not the owl knew everything about the nature of the dream. However, given that he doesn't mention the existence of nightmares within the dream until after Link defeats them, along with saying he is the guardian of the dream world, it isn't a massive leap to assume that he probably knew what would happen. So when the owl tells Link that no one knows for sure if the island Island will disappear. This seems like a lie told to convince Link to keep going. Link spends a lot of time becoming part of the island, and if he knew for sure that waking the Windfish would cause everything to disappear, to cause Marin to disappear, he might not want to wake it. He might rather stay. Of course, the player can technically choose to do this by just turning off the game before beating the final boss, but that isn't really satisfying because it doesn't lead to an actual resolution anyone gets to see. For the game to truly end, Link needs to awaken the Windfish and let Koholint Island disappear. Certainly, there is a very valid moral argument that the Windfish's life is more valuable than the lives of those within his dream. But regardless of that, the Windfish is not the one Link spends time with throughout the adventure. The Windfish is not the one whose wishes Link hears. The Windfish is not the one players care about. So whether or not it's the right thing to do, it's upsetting. For the longest time though, I felt that I must be missing something, that I must not have entirely understood the story, and this disconnect stems from the final cutscene. Link, stranded in the middle of the ocean, looks up to see the Windfish flying overhead, and he smiles as a triumphant rendition of the Ballad of the Windfish plays in the background. Link's reaction in those final moments differed so greatly from mine when I first saw it, and I always questioned why the developers chose to end the game on that note. It could be as simple as Link feeling relieved that the Windfish may be able to save him from his current predicament of floating in the middle of the ocean. It could be him being happy to know that the dream of Koholint Island wasn't his own, but rather one shared with someone else, making everything from it to live on in a small sort of way. It could be him accepting that all things end, and the only thing one can really do is remember the past with love and move forward. It could be a lot of things. It could also be nothing. Link's Awakening is one of those games that I've played during various stages of my life and gotten something new from it each time. When I was 8, I thought it was sad that Link had to leave his friends, that no matter what, he'd only ever be left with the memory of them. Today though, I see Link as someone who needed to make a nearly impossible choice where no matter what, other people who didn't deserve it, would lose. And even though the choice benefited him in some ways, it hurt him in 1,000 others. Every time I've finished Link's Awakening, I've left feeling a little empty. Like despite trying my best, I only ended up making things worse. And personally, that is what I love about this title. I adore games that have the ability to elicit this kind of emotional response. In general, Zelda games do a good job of creating stories that resonate with players, and the series has long been one that explores meaningful themes that extend far beyond the games themselves. Majora's Mask dives into grief and legacy, Ocarina of Time looks at innocence and the loss of it, Breath of the Wild tackles failure and acceptance. Nearly every Zelda game has a core theme it examines, and the way that theme is typically addressed involves Link conquering his obstacles and becoming a hero who saves the day. Awakening does things a little differently though. Link's problems aren't solved by simply turning into a hero. It asks more from players than that. It asks them to make a choice with greater complexity than right versus wrong. It asks them to sometimes be seen as the bad guy, in a weird way that wasn't clear to me until I became one myself. It asks them to be an adult. And sometimes that means accepting that everything ends, and still being able to look up and smile at the dreams of days past.